Hello everybody, welcome to number 27. I'm Jack and this is a C5 Corvette. Now it's interesting because in Europe, Corvettes always seem to be forced to compete on price. So you could get an awful lot of horsepower for not very much money. The flip side though, is that vets traditionally are supposed to be terrible handlers and terrible quality. The C5 was the first model that supposedly was going to turn that around. I'm not 100% convinced. That's because it combines some extremely advanced engineering with some really bizarre antiquated solutions, including the use of wood on part of the structure. Let's start with the cutting edge stuff. So this was the very first car to have a hydroform chassis. It was 4 times stiffer than the Corvette that came before. It has double wishbone independent suspension all round. It has active dampers. The engine is all aluminium and it is a transaxle, so that makes weight distribution a perfect 50-50. On top of all that, it's one of the very first cars to have a head-up display. But, and this is where I find it quite odd what they did. So the body is basically called SMC, so it's supposed to be some sort of composite. Ultimately, it's a variation of fiberglass, but where it really does fall down, potentially, is, okay, it has an all-aluminium engine, but that engine is a 2-valve pushrod V8. And this car still has leaf springs. They are made of composite, but they are leaf springs, and I'm just not convinced that that's going to work so well. So let's take it out now and I'm going to see, is it just a car that could only work in the States or can it work in Europe too? So I've been told that the traction control on this is awful and to switch it off. So I've already been for a little drive in it. It feels fairly benign, so I think I'm going to risk it and have traction control off on this drive. Now something else that has to be mentioned is that they look like they should be heavy. They're not. 1,430 kilograms, probably the same weight, if not slightly lighter than a 355. The bizarre thing is though, they do have a long wheelbase. It's about 20 centimeters longer than the equivalent 911. I don't know why they did that. We'll see if it affects how it turns in a moment. But so far, first impressions are, okay, you can't get over this interior. It looks so incredibly cheap. 996s, Porsche 996s were criticized for having a plastically horrible interior, but this is on another level. It is so low rent. These buttons, the textures, the plastics, the way it's laid out, everything about it screams cheapness. But driving position, the seat, for me anyway, really comfortable. I can't quite stretch my legs as far as I would like, ideally. Can probably move this seat back a little bit, which I will try and do now. Yeah. So that will help a little bit. You may not like the way the interior looks, but ergonomically, it kind of does work. You have all the buttons within reach. Everything is easy to understand, easy to use. It has ice cold aircon still, even this particular car, which is, I think it's year 2000. And it has 130,000 miles. That considered, there are signs of wear on the interior. Some of the plastics are rubbing through a little bit, but it really doesn't look bad for that. The other great thing is that, of course, these are pretty cheap to run. Not only are parts fairly easy to get hold of, but on a run, if you're careful, you can easily achieve 30 miles to the gallon, which is so impressive for a 6-litre V8. Okay, so let's see how this engine performs. stutter in second there. And for a 2-valve pushrod engine, it's really quite impressive. 350 horsepower these had. Now, competing with them at the time would have been a Ferrari 355 or a 360, which cost pretty much double the price. And to me, a 355 certainly does not feel as fast as one of these. The way it delivers the power is fairly unremarkable in a way, in that it just pushes up, keeps going. There's no peaks and troughs. It's got torque low down, but interestingly, for a pushrod engine, it is really happy to rev up to 6. And when you go down into the next gear, you're back in the power and it really shoves you forward. So it may have some ancient technology, but having the engine like that, it just seems to work pretty well. I mean, it sounds good. Having the pushrod engine means that it can be more tightly packaged. So the front end is very low. These have a really good aerodynamic of 0.29, so, or 0.29, whichever way you're supposed to pronounce it. So that is also because the engine is so flat, so low down, and so compact. The other thing I was quite worried about was those leaf springs. As you can see, it's not really a traditional leaf spring because it doesn't have layers of material sandwiched. It seems to be one bit of composite material. So it's more like a torsion spring really than a leaf spring in my mind. They sit at the bottom of the dampers. And it does seem to work fairly well. I mean, in some ways, I need to check and see how to stiffen up the suspension actually, because it rides very well and it's almost slightly too soft. Performance, so it's already there. The ride control is already on performance. If I put it on tour, let me see if I can feel it softening up. Yes, I can actually. Wow, that definitely becomes more supple. So performance is the stiffest setting. Seemed to give it a little bit more control. But let's see how it is on the little S's here. Just keeps on pulling to that 6,000 RPM red line. It's so tractable, this engine. It's also very smooth. I mean, it only revs to 6, but all the same, I'm really quite impressed. It sounds good. It doesn't have the excitement, obviously, of a high revving Ferrari lump, but it's a really nice engine. Change is a little bit obstructive, it's a little bit notchy, it doesn't like to be rushed. I don't know if that's because it's a transaxle maybe. It's not a deal breaker, but it's not the absolute pinnacle. It turns really sharply, you get good feedback, front and back. And you can just use that torque to slingshot out of a corner. This is great, it's really, really good. I'm surprised. It's definitely not as sharp as, say, even a 355, although the 355 has vastly number steering than this does. But it doesn't feel as sharp, it doesn't feel as lithe. Although it is quite light, I think perhaps having that longer wheelbase means it turns okay. And you can place the car quite precisely on the road, but it's maybe lacking some of the agility that some of those Ferraris have. The brakes quite powerful. There isn't a huge amount of feel at the pedal. One thing I noticed is that at speed, it does seem to move around a little bit, but to me it feels more like perhaps it needs a Geo. I don't think the original cars would have been like that. There's also a very slight delay from when you initially turn. I mean, we're talking fractions of a second before it hooks up, which again makes me think that the Geo just needs to be checked. Or perhaps it's running on quite old tyres, maybe it'd be enough to change the tyres. But you have to feel for the Americans when they made this, because it is such a good car. To me, the one thing, I know everyone says this, but I'll explain why it's really important. The one thing that lets it down is the interior. But it's particularly disappointing in this case, because I think this is a car that genuinely could have gone much further in changing the opinion that people had of Corvettes, because the handling is great, the engine is great, it's well thought out, it's got some real class-leading features, and yet the interior is so cheap. But of course the car was so much better value than the equivalents, and I mean, it's not like a 355 has a particularly nice interior, but it does feel more special than this. But I guess to make them cheap, something had to give, and it seems that, as in previous Corvettes, it was still in this, the interior. Just imagine what this car could have been, or what people would have thought about it, if it had a better designed, better made interior. It could have really changed the perception of these cars forever. In my mind, this is still an absolute bargain. So you can buy a good C5 now for about £15,000. They're great handlers, they're comfortable. I think it would make a great GT car. It's still fun to drive, even on our tiny little windy European roads. So it's a car I really have a lot of affection for. I think that GM did really well with this. I'm impressed. If you had an idea that all Corvettes were crap, well, this would definitely change it.